This meeting will probably be pretty short and sweet. For the most part, we've just been chugging along on the things that we have been working on. And yeah, we can get into some of the progress we've been making. So we'll start out with the TEC progress. So the initial version of the smart contracts for that have been merged. And we're making some pretty minor improvements to them. So we, I think I covered this on the last call, but we decided for this initial version, it will essentially be open order book plus the ability to soft cancel, plus a 1 second delay in between fills or in between requesting a fill and getting your fill request approved. So this version will not handle any trade collisions. It's more a way to create better liquidity for open order book type relayers. So now market makers can request that their orders be canceled, and the TEC essentially promises not to fill those orders in the future, and that'll happen instantly off of the blockchain. And then in addition, this 1 second delay gives market makers a little bit of extra time over takers to actually perform these cancels. And they should be able to provide more competitive pricing because they will have fewer stale orders that are getting filled. We've also been making really good progress on the actual server design of this. So there's going to be a reference server implementation that interacts with our smart contracts, and that'll be baked into LaunchKit as well. Does anyone have any questions on the TEC so far? Just as a side note, we're also thinking about the best terminology to use here. TEC is a bit hard to understand if you haven't really looked into the complexities of it. If you say the whole thing out, trade execution coordinator, it's a bit of a mouthful. So yeah, just thinking of maybe reducing that to coordinator or something like that. Also kind of makes sense because this initial version will just be handling cancels and won't be doing any sort of order matching or anything like that. So they're not not necessarily coordinating execution, I guess. And also just wanted to point out one more detail about this implementation that might be useful to some. I know some people have expressed that there could be some regulatory concerns around matching orders and stuff like that. So in this version, you will be doing none of that.
When should we expect this to be available to us to test with, to play with, to kind of see the specs on?
I would say probably 2 weeks or so. The smart contracts probably aren't going to change very much from here other than optimizations after one small PR is merged. And then we'll go ahead and deploy that to the test nets. We'll deploy it to our Ganache snapshot. And we just need to make the server implementation public and people can start playing around with it. All right, moving on. So we just had our first token vote around approving ZIP 23, which adds the ability for trading bundles of assets into the protocol. that has been approved. Overwhelming majority of people. There weren't really any surprises there, but just wanted to make sure that there were enough eyes on it and things like that. So the transactions have already been submitted to the Asset Proxy owner about a week ago. So in about another week, these will go live on mainnet. And again, all of the tooling around that has already been implemented in our code base. For the next vote, it will most likely be using a very similar process. I think there's been some talk about if the votes should be public before they're finalized, or if we should use balances at the beginning of the vote or the end of the vote, things like that. So there might be some slight tweaks in the process, but the next vote will probably be to add support for ERC 1155 assets. That has, we've been making pretty good progress on that as well. There's some work in progress. PR is up right now, just adding more tests. And then, of course, I just saw John hop on the call, but those are going to need to be audited at some point as well. So I would expect to see that within the next couple of months. Any questions around adding support for ERC 1155 or the governance process in general? I'm curious how many of you actually participated in the initial vote, and yeah, if there are thoughts around any improvements that can be made. Cool.
I did vote, Amir.
Awesome. It's great to hear, Jacob. I voted too. All right. We can move on. We've also started to begin some light work on version 3.0. Initially, we're just going to be implementing some pretty basic features. I wouldn't expect any huge changes in the near term. It's mostly going to be around efficiency, making things more accessible to developers, and potentially adding some more robust ways to validate things. So our first step in that is adding better revert reasons. So we're trying to standardize a format for encoding actual parameters within revert reasons. So once we do this, you should be able to validate any 0x transactions by just making a call to that function first. And then if there is a revert reason, you can see exactly why that was reverted, which order was affected, things like that. And this is kind of the first step to making our smart contracts language agnostic, because you'll now be able to write very thin wrappers in any languages. You don't really need to worry about doing different sorts of validation and stuff like that. So that is a work in progress now as well, and I expect to see that close to final in the next 2 weeks also. Is Austin on this call by any chance?
I am. Can you hear me?
You want to talk about EtherCattle?
Yeah, sure. For a little over a year now, Open Relay has been working on an internal project that we called the EtherCattle Initiative. And unless you're familiar with our ETH Denver hackathon project from this year, your mind might go to a project where you buy, sell, and breed digital cows. That was our hackathon project. That's not what EtherCattle is about. EtherCattle is about operationalizing Ethereum clients. So if you're familiar with the IT trope that servers should be cattle and not pets, that is to say, when something goes wrong, you should be able to shoot it in the head and get a new one and have the new one be just as good as the old one. That's the naming behind EtherCattle. We've essentially set out to try and remove a lot of the operational challenges of Ethereum clients. And the approach that we've taken for that is to implement streaming replication. So essentially we have an Ethereum client, and it's using Geth. It's a fork of Geth that eventually we might like to see merged back upstream, but that hasn't been a priority yet. So essentially there's a Geth client that runs just like a normal Geth client does, does peer-to-peer connections, receives new blocks, validates all of the transactions, but then as it's writing things out to its LevelDB database under the hood, it also puts those LevelDB write operations onto a Kafka channel. Then we have a bunch of replicas pulling messages off of those Kafka topics and writing them to their local LevelDB databases so that they don't have to maintain peer-to-peer connections. They don't have to do block validation, transaction validation, etc. The master takes care of all of that, and they just take essentially a copy of what the master has on disk. So the result of that is that we have these replicas that are much lighter weight because they don't have to maintain peer-to-peer connections. They don't have to do validation. And then we also have the ability to spin up new replicas, because if we take a snapshot of an existing replica, and then it might be a couple of days out of date, but it comes online, and all of the changes that have happened since its snapshot was taken are available in Kafka, so it can get up to speed very quickly without having to establish peers, without having to do block and transaction validation. So you can spin up replicas in much less time than you could do so with a conventional system. So in any case, our replica software is heavily based on Geth, and is really just kind of a thin wrapper, but we are trying to verify that our replication process doesn't have any issues and that our replicas are serving information correctly. So we have a completely public Goerli testnet endpoint that we are inviting the world to come bang at and see if they have any issues. We also have a semi-public mainnet endpoint. I'm trying to keep something resembling tabs on who has access to, or who knows the URL for the mainnet endpoint, just because my goal is that nobody is running important financial transactions through our mainnet endpoint, which may possibly be serving inaccurate information because it is a new piece of software. As it stands, Open Relay has been running a staging environment off of our replicas for a little over a month. Personally, I have been running my MetaMask off of our replica for a couple of weeks, and the most recent issues that we've turned up were actually issues in core Geth that I now have a pull request out to Geth to fix. So in any case, if anybody is interested in helping us test out our replica software, there is a channel on Discord where we are discussing, and you can get access to the URL. I would encourage you to, I don't know if I can actually invite people to that channel. It is a private channel, but if you talk to anybody on the 0x team, they can get you an invite to that channel. And if you run into any issues, please let me know so that we can start looking into what problems arise.
Cool, thank you for that. Yeah, if anyone wants to be a part of that, feel free to ping Jacob or Rahul on our Discord, and we can add you to that channel. At some point, hopefully we can open it up for mass testing. Cool. So I wanted to call out one more thing that we've been working on but haven't really talked about yet. So this is still largely in the R&D phase right now. Basically messing around with a couple toy implementations and also writing a white paper. But we are planning on creating a peer-to-peer order book as essentially a replacement for the standard Relayer API. So we've just found that it's hard to get everyone to implement the same exact specification. There will be bugs in some. A lot of relayers aren't either broadcasting their liquidity or pulling liquidity from other relayers and stuff like that. So we're aiming to basically replace that entirely. Relayers will still have the same role that they do today, except that this should provide a greater degree of standardization and make it easier to interact with a protocol in general. So now, relayers who opt into this will essentially be part of an actual global liquidity pool, and it should be much easier for traders to interact with as well. I'm sure there are some questions around that, so yeah, happy to answer anything on anyone's minds. Or not.
I guess what stage of development is that at? I mean,
I believe a white paper is almost complete, and I'm not sure if Rahul started sending it out to relayers yet, but I think we were planning on doing that today or in the next few days to get feedback. In terms of actual development, it's pretty early on. Yeah, not a ton of actual code has been written for it yet, but we have been able to whip up a proof of concept, basically for just like a basic chat app that's running this node in browser. It's kind of cool.
I'm sure we'll have questions once we learn more about it.
Yeah. Cool. So yeah, as I said, pretty short and sweet agenda. If anyone has any general questions about anything, we're happy to talk about that.
Yeah. Hi, it's Gab. RigoBlock is supporting 0xv2, so I have a question about the signature. Within signatures, we send a signature type. So I'm wondering, I was trying to understand from the APIs if it can be avoided to be put as input. I mean, there's no such API in your JavaScript libraries, but I might be wrong, so please tell me if I'm wrong. Could it be possible to implement an API that returns the type of signature when a valid signature is found?
What do you mean when a valid signature is found?
Well, I mean, right now, basically, when you send the transaction, you have to send the signature type, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So basically, if the code tried all the signature types and found a valid signature, then it could return the type of that signature.
I see. In these orders you're seeing, do they not already contain the signature byte? Or do you just want like a mapping of signature byte to signature type?
Yeah, I mean, basically, a relayer has to know what signature type a transaction has, but if you try all the signature, I don't know how much more load would get on the codes, but so a relayer might independently already discriminate between one signature type and the other, but the signature validation might be doing the job automatically, so without the need to put in the signature type as input. As input in the JavaScript API call, that of course it would still be the input for the signature part.
Is this distinguishing the fact that some Web3 providers do the header injection and some don't?
Not really. It's to me, it's more for like an ease of interaction. Like we're using the is wallet signature, so it's kind of not the default choice of relayers that normally interact with single accounts, because we basically interact from smart contracts. So for ease of integrations with third parties with relayers, without them having to kind of modify the API to create a special APIs just for us, which basically they're willing to do anyway. So, and they're doing anyway. So that's not an issue, but it could potentially facilitate that.
Yeah, honestly, I'm not sure I fully understand the issue. It'd be great if you could maybe post this in our development channel on Discord.
Sure.
Yeah. Any other questions about anything? Awesome. Well, thank you for joining.
I guess I was going to jump in on one last one here. Just yeah, I know this is kind of harkening back to the TEC there at the beginning. You know, you said that this doesn't deal with order collisions in the first iteration there. When can we expect? You know, are we expecting order collisions to be dealt with in the in a secondary version coming later? Or is that on the roadmap in the near future or in the far future?
I think so the tricky part about dealing with order collisions is around reserving orders and like blacklisting takers and stuff like that. There's basically a lot of issues around taker griefing. And this model that we're working on right now still has some of those issues, but they're at a much smaller scale. So I think we kind of want to see how those things manifest, and then decide on what makes sense to mitigate those issues at scale in the future. So yeah, it's definitely on the roadmap. I will say that, so in my eyes, well, first of all, there are two types of trade collisions, right? There are accidental trade collisions, and then there are the ones where trade is actually being front run. So with this model that we're working on right now, I think there will be very little front running, because makers will be able to cancel their orders, and there will be fewer profitable orders to front run in the first place. There will be fewer arbitrage opportunities on the relayers, or on the relayers that are using the TEC. So I think you're pretty much going to have accidental trade collisions. So part of the problem is kind of indirectly mitigated.
Okay, I was just looking at kind of what the timescale is we should expect on that. So, it definitely sounds like get this first version out there, continue to think on it and see where that goes. Is
yeah. So another thing is that I think we'll probably release an upgrade to the core smart contracts in maybe 6 months or so, and I think, assuming we launch this version of the TEC within the next month, that'll give people ample time to kind of experiment with this version, and then it'll probably need to be upgraded again anyways after the V3 launch. So that seems like probably the right timing to expect something new.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Cool. Sounds good. Thanks for joining, everyone.